Main milestones of the Second Indochina War, the last direct military confrontation between the two world superpowers, the USSR and the USA. The Vietnam War, less frequently referred to as the Second Indochina War, was the most vivid and long-lasting confrontation between the world's two major political systems. On one hand, it directly involved the United States leading the anti-communist world, and on the other, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam representing the communist world, with Moscow and Beijing behind it. Even the war in Afghanistan, comparable in timing to the war in Vietnam, was not such a vivid demonstration of the willingness of the main Cold War adversaries to defend their ideological maxims in open combat. A tremendous amount of research, volumes of historical books, and thousands of newspaper articles have been written about the causes of the war. By and large, both economic and political interests of the U.S. could not but draw the country into a massacre that, in many respects, became the largest military operation of the U.S. Army in the 20th century. And the longest, that is for sure. In a decade, the last American troops guarding the U.S. Embassy in Saigon left the country in 1975. 3,403,100 U.S. citizens fought in the jungles and skies of Vietnam, the ground and skies of Laos and Cambodia, and the seas around the peninsula. That is 4 times less than the number of Americans who took part in World War II. More than 12 million U.S. citizens fought in it. The ratio of losses in the Vietnam War was half as much as in World War II. In 10 Vietnam years, the American Armed Forces lost 148 men, 1 in 58, while in all theaters of combat operations of World War II in 4 years, 339, that is, 1 in 30. But the psychological toll was far greater. The Vietnam War had such an enormous impact on American society and damaged the international prestige of the United States so badly that it took almost 10 years to restore domestic and foreign policy balance, until similar losses were sustained by the Soviet Union, which was bogged down in Afghanistan. It is impossible to describe in detail the entire history of the Vietnam War in a short article. Experienced researchers spend hundreds of pages on it, and still have to leave some details out. But it is realistic to look at the chronology and understand how the catastrophe of Washington's decision to engage in a civil war between the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and South Vietnam gradually escalated. Its first op-eds went up in 1960. The formal beginning of direct U.S. military involvement in the war between North and South Vietnam is considered to be March 8, 1965. On that date, the first 2 battalions of U.S. Marines began unloading in Da Nang, a port on the coast of the South China Sea. But the immediate occasion for America's military intervention in the Vietnamese Civil War dates back to 1964. These are the 2 so-called Tonkin incidents, attacks by North Vietnamese torpedo boats on U.S. destroyers. The first incident was really organized by North Vietnam, which confessed it, but the second incident was in fact inspired by the American side, and the radio intercepts proved to be a fabrication, as it turned out much later. Nevertheless, America bombed the North Vietnamese Army and Navy bases the day after the second Tonkin incident. It was the first of its kind and was codenamed Piercing Arrow. In 1965, the bombing resumed and would continue until October 31, 1968, collectively dubbed the Thunderclap. Also in 1965, the first major combat operation would take place, in which not only South Vietnamese troops and their main adversary, the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, Viet Cong, but also American units would face off for the first time in a ground battle. It was Operation Starlight, which the Marines conducted near their base Chulé. Technically, the victory went to the Americans. In fact, they defeated the Viet Cong's 1st Regiment, but the guerrillas managed to severely beat the enemy. Also this year, in July, the Soviet S-75 air defense systems were used in combat for the first time in Vietnam. A little earlier, in April, the North Vietnamese pilots opened their combat account by shooting down 2 American F-105 fighters. The same year also saw the first major ground battle in which the U.S. and North Vietnamese armies came into direct combat. It went down in history as the Battle of the Ia Drang Valley and became one of the fiercest and bloodiest battles of the Vietnam War. Both sides still consider the outcome of the battle as their victory, although it would be accurate to say that the massacre, which according to various sources, took the lives of between 1,500 and 3,000 people, ended with almost nothing. '66 was probably the quietest year in terms of ground fighting, but the air war continued unabated, gradually becoming more global. In December of that year, the U.S. Air Force for the first time ventured far to the north, well above the DMZ separating North and South Vietnam along the 17th parallel, and bombed Hanoi, the capital of the DRV. The success of the bombing was little consolation for America's airmen, who had experienced what was known as Black Friday a week and a half earlier. That day was December 2, when in a single day the U.S. Air Force lost 8 combat aircraft to the North Vietnamese. Such a thing had never happened in the Vietnam War before or since. The losses were all the more painful for the U.S. when one recalls that 6 months earlier the Hanoi Parade had been organized in Hanoi. 55 American pilots, shot down since the beginning of the war and captured, were led through the streets of the North Vietnamese capital. The DRV authorities never dared to do anything like that again. The parade almost ended in a lynching. The personal score of the North Vietnamese people to the American pilots who, although their country did not officially declare war on the DRV, literally incinerated the towns, villages, and fields of the North Vietnamese. The year began with a major U.S. air war success. On January 2 in Operation Bolo, the Americans were able to avenge their Black Friday losses. 5 of the newest Soviet MiG-21 fighters were trapped and shot down at once, the largest losses of this type of aircraft during the Vietnam War. But this year was also the first year, since the beginning of the war, when the U.S. Army's monthly losses exceeded 1,000. This happened in March and was caused by Operation Junction City, which began in late February, the largest ground operation by U.S. troops at the time. Over 25,000 U.S. troops and comparable numbers of South Vietnamese military units were involved. Operation Junction Station went down in the history of the Vietnam War as the only case of airborne troops. Before and after the landing, paratroopers were only dropped from helicopters. However, the U.S. Army Command was unable to achieve the stated goal of eliminating the headquarters of the guerrilla movement and disrupting the movement of men and weapons along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The result of the November 1967 Battle of Dak To was equally ambiguous. This was the name given to the series of successive battles between the U.S. and South Vietnamese armies on the one hand and the DRV Army units on the other, that erupted on the central plateau of South Vietnam. The scale and ferocity of the battle eclipsed even the Viet Trang battle, which had been fought 2 years earlier. According to official data alone, the two sides lost about 2,000 men, not counting twice as many wounded. The American media tried to say as little as possible about this bloody battle, and historians do not know it as well as they do about the battle in the Viet Trang Valley. One of the main reasons for this was the surge of anti-war sentiment in the United States in the fall of that year. The rapidly rising casualties, the chilling accounts of the first returning Vietnam veterans, multiplied by the rapidly spreading peace-loving views of the hippies, all culminated in one of the most famous anti-war actions. In October, America held its first national protest against the Vietnam War, the so-called March on the Pentagon. After that, it was no longer possible for the White House to turn a blind eye to the anti-war sentiment and continue the same policy in Vietnam. And this directly predetermined the events of the following year. The success of the anti-war campaign in the U.S. was logical. The following year there was a presidential election, and neither candidate could afford to ignore the sentiments of a significant part of the electorate. Moreover, the rapidly growing losses of the American Army, the rapidly deteriorating image of the United States in the international arena, and the clear preponderance of opponents of war in society forced the incumbent President Lyndon Johnson to announce in advance that he would not run for a second term. And so as not to remain in the memory of voters as a categorical hawk, Johnson simultaneously, with this announcement in March, gives the order to stop bombing the main part of North Vietnam. The United States will abandon them completely only on October 31, the eve of the presidential election. But the anti-war demonstrations in America itself would not be enough to shake the Hawks' position so much. Another reason was the two large-scale offensives by the Viet Cong, one in late January and the other in early May. Although both offensives brought no strategic gain to North Vietnam, they clearly demonstrated that the forces and capabilities of the opponents of the Saigon regime were growing, despite the best efforts of the U.S. and South Vietnamese armies. It is no coincidence that it was after the Second May offensive in Paris that the preliminary phase of peace talks between Hanoi and Saigon began. On November 5, Richard Nixon becomes the new U.S. president, defeating his rivals by betting on the rhetoric around an honorable peace in Vietnam. It is Nixon who is destined to go down in history as the man who managed to turn 180 degrees in politics during his 4 years in office and ended his career with the loudest scandal in U.S. political history. It was the year of the U.S. Army's most extensive presence in Vietnam and the year of a catastrophic rise in its losses. As of April, there were 543,400 U.S. Army troops in South Vietnam, and combat casualties since the beginning of the active phase of American intervention in the Vietnam Civil War exceeded those of the Korean War. This data, which circulated widely in America amid growing anti-war sentiment, led the Nixon administration to declare the beginning of Vietnamization, the complete replacement of U.S. ground troops by South Vietnamese troops. It was publicly announced on June 8, and exactly 1 month later, on July 8, U.S. troops really began to leave South Vietnamese territory. That, however, did not stop the remaining U.S. air units from continuing massive raids in neighboring Cambodia, rather than in Vietnam, where they tried to destroy the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army supply bases. But while fighting in Vietnam subsided by the end of the year, political battles broke out with renewed vigor in the United States. In mid-November, details of the American military's war crime in Song My became known for the first time. The tragedy of the shooting of 500,000 civilians on the orders of Lieutenant William Kelly was at once world-famous, and 3 days later it became the catalyst for a long-planned second national protest, march against the war in Vietnam. Moreover, in America itself, Vietnamization was seen as a way not to de-escalate, but to escalate the war. For while U.S. ground troops were indeed withdrawn from Vietnam, the Air Force had only intensified its operations. The extent to which Vietnamization negatively affected the course of the war in Vietnam became clear in April 1970, when the U.S. Army, together with the South Vietnamese Army, launched an invasion of Cambodia. The formal aim of the operation was to destroy the bases of the Viet Cong and the DRV Army on Cambodian territory. In reality, the main purpose of the offensive was to support the anti-communist Cambodian government of General Lon Nol, which had earlier overthrown the neutral Norodom Sihanouk cabinet. The 8,000-strong American contingent left Cambodia only in late July, but the South Vietnamese contingent remained, continuing to control virtually the entire country with the strongest American air support. As a result, the Vietnamese Civil War engulfed the neighboring state, and Washington's political games eventually led to one of the worst humanitarian disasters of the 20th century, the establishment of the Khmer Rouge regime of Pol Pot in Cambodia. That same year, but in late November, one of American intelligence's most carefully prepared operations, a raid on the Son Tay prison camp near Hanoi, ended in an extremely high-profile failure. After killing 50 North Vietnamese soldiers and losing none of its own fighters, American Special Forces were unable to free a single compatriot, simply because there had not been a single American prisoner of war in the camp for months. This high-profile fiasco became a symbol of the incompetence of American intelligence and Special Forces leadership for years to come, but eventually led to a simplification and improvement in the command and planning of special operations. The year that began relatively peacefully went down in the history of the war as the beginning of the occupation of Laos. Although the U.S. Congress prohibited the use of ground troops in Operation Lam Son 719, U.S. air and artillery support for the invasion by South Vietnamese forces was extensive. They spent a month and a half on Laotian territory, one of the bloodiest in the small country's history. As with the invasion of Cambodia, the formal motive was to eliminate the Viet Cong bases and supply routes. But there was no pro-American government in Laos, so the South Vietnamese Army, despite all the American support, had to retreat. These events led to a further rise in anti-war sentiment in America, which culminated in the famous action to repudiate Vietnam veterans' war medals. Several hundred people threw their medals to the steps of the Capitol, protesting the goals and methods of the war in which they had been forced to participate. But even these radical methods could no longer disrupt the Nixon administration's course of Vietnamization. As a result, at the end of the year, the U.S. Air Force was ordered to carry out several bombing strikes in North Vietnam and carried them out. 1972 was the peak of the Nixon Vietnamization, the policy that began as a peacekeeping one but quickly degenerated into an escalatory one and finally, despite the efforts of its initiators, led to the end of the war much faster than it could have happened without it. In 1972, the U.S. Army, anxious to cope with a large-scale Viet Cong offensive supported by the DRV Army, resumed regular massive bombing of North Vietnamese territory. In addition, America decided to mine the North Vietnamese ports from the air, a step that no one dared to take at the beginning of the war for fear of the Eastern Bloc's reaction. As the air and sea battles intensified, the last ground unit of the U.S. Army was evacuated. But even this peaceful step could not convince the North Vietnamese leadership to abandon direct support for the Viet Cong. And then America decides to take a radical measure. On Washington's orders, it begins carpet bombing the largest North Vietnamese cities, Hanoi and Haiphong, with strategic bombers. The agreement provided for an immediate cessation of U.S. military operations in Vietnam and for the complete withdrawal of American troops from South Vietnam within 2 months, while eliminating all U.S. military bases. In addition, the sides were obliged to exchange prisoners of war, and South Vietnam was obliged to hold free and democratic elections. In reality, however, the only thing that ended was that America stopped its direct involvement in the Vietnam War and received back all of its prisoners of war handed over by North Vietnam by the end of March. No elections were ever held, and the ceasefire was constantly violated by both Saigon and Hanoi. In August of that year, the U.S. Congress made a crucial decision. All use of American forces in Indochina in hostilities was henceforth forbidden. But the withdrawal of the American Army did not mean an end to Washington's political and military economic support of the Saigon regime. January 1974 was the moment when periodic violations of the ceasefire resulted in a de facto resumption of hostilities. To be fair, it should be noted that this time it was the Viet Cong that initiated it. To be more precise, it was Hanoi. The North Vietnamese Army was not considered by the DRV as a foreign force whose presence on the territory of South Vietnam was forbidden by the Paris Agreement. Accordingly, his government had no intention of withdrawing the North Vietnamese Army. The actual offensive of the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces at the beginning of the year was stopped by the South Vietnamese troops with relative success. This was in no small part due to the presence in their ranks of a 20,000-strong contingent of American military advisors. Under the peace treaty, Saigon had the right to use their services, but this was the last success for Saigon, whose political stability was weakening by the day. In addition, the Provisional Revolutionary Government of South Vietnam, formed in June 1969, was active in both the domestic and international arenas, gaining more and more political weight and sympathy. After all, it was this political structure that represented the Viet Cong at the peace talks in Paris, and it was now increasingly perceived as the real power in South Vietnam in the near future. The crisis in a South Vietnamese economy overheated by military expenditures and successive political tightening also contributed to this. Not surprisingly, the second half of the year was a time of final reversal of the situation in favor of the Viet Cong and North Vietnam. A crucial moment came in August when Richard Nixon, Saigon's main ally across the ocean, was forced to resign as a result of the Watergate scandal, the loudest political revelation in U.S. history. And in December, the armed forces of the Provisional Revolutionary Government of South Vietnam and the Army of the DRV launched a decisive offensive, very quickly establishing control over Phuoc Long province. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese did not formally gain full control of Phuoc Long until January 6, 1975. But the most important result of the operation was not the territorial success, but the fact that the offensive did not provoke a significant reaction from the United States. Shaken by political crisis and anti-war demonstrations, America was forced to submit to the Paris Agreement. Therefore, Hanoi and its allies had their hands free. On March 1, the largest offensive in the history of the war began by troops of the Provisional Revolutionary Government of South Vietnam and the DRV. The offensive literally rolled southward from the slopes of the Central Mountain Range of South Vietnam. By early April, they had succeeded in completely liberating 12 provinces with a total population of about 8 million. The South Vietnamese army had by then lost more than one-third of its personnel, including its most combat-ready units and half its weaponry. Saigon's collapse was inevitable, and the U.S. began to do its last duty to its losing ally. Washington organized the evacuation of all those who did not want to be under Viet Cong rule. The operation, called Gusty Wind, began at dawn on April 29, and in just 18 hours, more than 1,000 American citizens and nearly 7,000 refugees left Saigon in American planes and helicopters. At 4:30 a.m. on April 30, a rocket attack on Saigon's Tan Son Nhut airport killed 2 U.S. Marines, the last American casualties of the Vietnam War. And at quarter to noon, a North Vietnamese T-54 tank burst onto the lawn in front of the presidential palace in Saigon, knocking out the gate. This famous photo became the symbol of the end of the Vietnam War. A few hours later, in the same palace, the complete surrender of South Vietnam was signed, and a new state, the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, appeared on the political map of the world, unifying and liberating a country that had remained a colony for a century and a half. Of course, the victory of the South Vietnamese opponents was just as impossible without the active support of the world's major communist powers, the USSR and China, as the long resistance in Saigon was without U.S. intervention. But neither Soviet nor Chinese troops were directly involved in the fighting on South Vietnamese territory. Although the Soviet Union had sent 6,359 generals and officers and over 4,500 enlisted men and women to Vietnam between July 1965 and December 1974, none of them, contrary to popular belief, had been involved in combat with the Americans or the South Vietnamese. Though the Soviet fighter pilots shot down the American airplanes over the DRV territory, the Soviet technicians and mechanics served the newest Soviet fighters MiG-21 and their big brothers MiG-17 and MiG-15, which were flown by the Vietnamese pilots. Alas, the Soviet military and, more importantly, politicians failed to analyze in time the lessons of the Vietnam War, which America learned at such a high cost. Many of the mistakes made by U.S. commanders and administrators during the Vietnam War would be repeated by the Soviet Union just 4 years later, in December 1979, when Soviet forces entered Afghanistan. But that will be a different story.